Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show that covers all things marketing. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast gives you the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. Whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand, you've come to the right place. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast starts now.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie, and on last week's episode, we talked about Harry Potter. Now, on that episode, I mentioned that there were other novels and other series that gained popularity and notoriety because of their marketing, similar to Harry Potter. And one of those books I mentioned was Twilight. And what is so interesting about Twilight is that the book itself isn't as critically acclaimed as Harry Potter is. But it gained a similar amount of attention because of its marketing. So I thought on today's episode we would explore the teen vampire drama Twilight, the entire book series and the movie series, and just really explore the marketing that took place around the series that helped create the phenomenon that was Twilight. So all that and more on today's episode of the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Just to start out today's episode, I would love to remind everybody that if you aren't, please subscribe to the podcast. We post new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I would love to get something going here where you guys ask questions and I could do a whole podcast where I answer them. So if you have any question, thoughts, or concerns about anything we talk about on the podcast episodes, please go ahead and write them in the review down below or reach out through social media. Okay, everyone, so let's jump right into today's podcast. I always like to start out the podcast by talking about what is new in the marketing world. Our first story is that 39 states are going to be investigating Juul's marketing and the impact it has on kids. So for those of you that don't know, Juul is a vape company and they create flavors for vapes. They are just sort of like the main front runner in America right now for that industry. So a coalition of 39 states are going to be looking into the marketing and sales of vaping products by Juul Labs, including whether the company targeted youth and made misleading claims about the nicotine content in their devices. Juul has released a statement saying that it has halted television, print, and digital advertising and eliminated most flavors in response to the concerns by the government officials and others. They have said, "We will continue to reset the vapor category in the U.S. and seek to earn the trust of society by working cooperatively with attorneys general, regulations, public health officials, and other stakeholders to combat underage youth and transition adult smokers from combustible cigarettes." So I find this article very interesting and this news story very interesting because obviously you would assume that the vape company wasn't going to put a halt on all their marketing because they obviously don't believe they're doing anything wrong. They don't believe that they are harming young children, or at least that's what we would all think when we think about the people running these companies, that they're very delusional about what their product is. However, it appears to me that it's the exact opposite. They want to help the situation. If they think kids are being targeted, then they want to ensure that that stops and that they're only targeting adults who still smoke actual cigarettes because that is their business model. So that's really interesting, and it's very fascinating to see the fact that they're willing to work with the public health officials and with society to sort of earn that trust because they believe that they are the future of smoking. And maybe they are, maybe they're not. I'm not sure. I don't smoke. I've never smoked, but I know quite a few people who do and quite a few people who vape. And I would just love to hear your guys' thoughts on what you think about all this, if you've seen any of Juul Labs marketing, if you think it is targeted to teenagers, if you think it isn't, if you think this whole thing has been blown out proportion. Please let me know, write it in the review down below or reach out through social media because this story is definitely a hot topic right now, quite literally because it's about vaping and smoking, so it's always going to be some sort of hot, if you know what I mean. But it's just super interesting to take a look at their marketing. And also, like they said, they had to remove a lot of their flavors because a lot of their flavors were targeted to something a kid might like, such as like a bubblegum flavor and cotton candy, and I think there was like a unicorn flavor, which seems kind of silly because I would never want to smoke a unicorn even if I did smoke. But it's all really interesting, and this story is only going to progress and become more and more interesting, so we are definitely going to be keeping an eye on it to see what happens next. Our second story of today is that Hulu's marketing chief, Kelly Campbell, has been promoted to lead the Disney-owned streaming service, Disney+. So Hulu marketing chief Kelly Campbell was named president of Disney+ this week. Her promotion comes after Hulu's CEO, Randy Freer, stepped down in February and Disney bought Hulu's operations closer to its direct-to-consumer international business. Kevin Mayer, who is the chairman of the company's direct-to-consumer and international division, said, "Kelly is an immensely talented leader who has been a driving force in defining Hulu's brand vision and strategy. She has built a tremendous multi-talented team and developed a strategic campaigns that helped double Hulu's subscriber base. Our senior leadership team is excited to welcome her aboard and can't wait to work together to further Hulu's footprint in the U.S. and beyond." Kelly Campbell said in response, "This is a time of tremendous growth and transformation for Hulu, and I am incredibly energized by the opportunity ahead as we enter into this next chapter. The Hulu team is among the brightest and most technology and creatively audacious in the industry. I know we are going to do great things as part of the pioneering and equally bold team Kevin has built at DTCI." So really great to hear that Kelly Campbell is moving up in both the Disney and the Hulu company. It's also really great to hear just how well Disney and Hulu have been working together since the merger, since Disney bought them, and how it's all going to be coming together with Disney+. Obviously, we talk about Disney+ a lot on this podcast because it kind of is the newest thing in marketing to have your own streaming service. Like, there was no reason for Disney to really have their own. They could have just kept putting their content on through Netflix or through Hulu, but Disney Plus really has been a game changer for a lot of companies. So it's really great just to hear how it's benefiting the people who work internally at Disney Plus and at Hulu, as well as it's benefiting everybody else. Disney Plus right now is in the middle of an interesting time because they've launched their product, they've seen great success with their product, but how do they keep that momentum? How do they keep growing? How do those numbers keep growing instead of just staying stagnant with how many subscribers they have and hope that none of them leave? They never want that number to decrease, but they always want it to increase. So hopefully Kelly Campbell and her team at Hulu and at Disney Plus can help come up with some more creative and engaging ideas to sort of keep their marketing at Disney Plus going and thriving. I have no doubt that that's going to happen, so I'm really excited to see what comes up next for Disney Plus and for Hulu. Our third story of today is that Rihanna's lingerie brand, Savage X Fenty, is skyrocketing and Victoria's Secret is paying for the price. So Savage X Fenty has been gaining market shares on Victoria's Secret to the point where its parent company, L Brands, has sold a controlling stake in the company to a private equity firm for a dismal $1.1 billion valuation. They had been suffering from the declining sales while Rihanna's lingerie brand has been skyrocketing, causing the legacy company to be spun off into a full private company. Savage X Fenty is poised to become the front runner in the global lingerie market that is expected to hit $325 billion by 2025. So one, congrats Rihanna. Two, it's a little disappointing to hear this is happening to Victoria's Secret. Obviously, as someone who grew up in a small city where we had one mall, we had an outlet mall, we all were very familiar with the brand Victoria's Secret and La Senza and sort of all those companies that are owned by L Brands. So it's super interesting to see them be suffering right now. But we are in a market world where companies that were big brands like this are no longer profitable because people of the millennial generation and of the Gen Z generation aren't as likely to be shopping there anymore as they are from privately owned companies or smaller celebrity-owned companies such as Savage X Fenty. So the trend is something that we have seen happen quite a bit, but it is just always interesting to see it happen to these very big companies such as Victoria's Secret. Let me know what you think of Savage X Fenty taking over Victoria's Secret and what you think will be happening next for both of these companies. Write it in the review down below or reach out through social media. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and take a short break from the podcast, but when we come back, we are going to be talking about Twilight and Twilight's marketing. So stay tuned for that because you are listening to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Technology Podcast covers everything tech. The hottest mobile phones, tablets, games. We review it, rate it, test it. Whether you're Microsoft or Apple, Android or iPhone, we'll give it to you again. Black and white. The Golden State Media Concepts Technology Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and on today's episode, we are talking about those bloodthirsty marketers. We are talking about Twilight. So for those of you that don't remember, Twilight was a 4-series book that turned into a 5-series movie that really took over media for the 7 years that those movies were being made, and it was in every magazine, it was on every show, it was in the theaters, it was everywhere, billboards, posters, your phone, social media. It really was just the center of everything for a really long time, especially for me because I was in middle school when they came out, so they were targeted to people my age. But it was sort of like a worldwide phenomenon. It was international. People really loved it, and people were interacting with it. And last week, we talked about Harry Potter and how Harry Potter had a similar effect on the world. But the interesting thing to compare between these two is that Harry Potter was a very critically acclaimed book. A lot of people talk about how wonderful the writing is with Harry Potter, whereas Twilight is often mocked for not really having that strong of a storyline, or a lot of people make fun of the fact that it's not really well written. Apparently you're able to go through the book with like a red pen and make edits. Like, it just wasn't as clean and it wasn't as well written, I think really is just the main word choice to use here. I mean, now I'm starting to sound like Stephanie Meyer, but it's basically just not as critically acclaimed, I think, is the main thing here. But because of marketing, the book was able to achieve a similar level of fandom as Harry Potter because they just knew how to market this product correctly, and they hit it at the right time. They used specific marketing strategies to really create this world and create this phenomenon around it. So that is what we are going to be talking about today. So just to get started, because I know a lot of people listening to this, and a lot of people, even if you were big fans of Twilight, it's been a couple of years. So I'm going to give you a bit of a refresher by throwing some marketing facts and stats at you about the book and the movie series. Publishing of the books began in 2005 and ended in 2008. The books are published through Little Brown and Company. Stephanie Meyer has said that the first Twilight book only took 3 months to write. The saga won the 2009 Kids' Choice Award for Favorite Book. The saga sold over 116 million copies. It has also been translated in over 38 languages. The first movie in the franchise, Twilight, that came out in 2009, cost $37 million to create, but grossed $392.5 million worldwide, roughly 10 times its production cost. The sequel, New Moon, was an even bigger success. It brought in $709.7 million worldwide, and it only cost $50 million to produce. The box office total for all 5 films, which was Twilight, New Moon, Eclipse, Breaking Dawn Part 1 and 2, was over $3 billion. According to Forbes, Kristen Stewart was the highest paid actress in 2012 with total earnings of $34.5 million a movie. And for those of you that can think back to when 2012 was, this was during the end of the Twilight series. She was getting paid that much to be in Twilight. So this entire book series that, sold over 1 million copies, earned over $1 billion when the movies, really was just for those years that it was being written before the movie even came out. And then once the movie came out, it was a worldwide, internationally beloved franchise. People were obsessed. There was merchandise, there was billboards, there were interviews, there were scandals. The scandals for this movie alone is something that really pushed the marketing forward. There was a lot of talk, especially during the last film, that Kristen Stewart and Rob Pattinson had been dating for the past couple of films, and she was now cheating on him, and then they would have to go film this movie together. So people were involved in the actors and the producers and the writers' real life and their interconnections between each other. It wasn't just that you cared about the characters or you cared about the world, you cared about the production that was Twilight. And now obviously not everybody in the entire world cared if Rob Pattinson and Kristen Stewart were together. That was not what I'm saying. But if you were involved in the series, you didn't just love the books, you didn't just like the movies, you were involved in the series. So what we're going to be talking about on today's podcast is how they were able to get people so involved with the series and so entranced by just the world they were creating. And it was only 4 books. How did they do that? What techniques did they use? What sort of marketing strategies and campaigns were employed so that they were able to create this world? We are going to be talking about all that and more on today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned. Make sure you get that pen and paper ready to go, because we're going to go ahead and take a short break here. But when we come back, I'm going to give you the 5 strategies Twilight used to promote their movie and to promote their book series. So stay tuned for that, because you are listening to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and on today's episode, we are talking about that teen love story that is as old as time. We are talking about Twilight. Now, obviously, in the cynical social media world that we live in today, Twilight is something that a lot of people make fun of. It's an ongoing joke. And hey, I participate in the joke a lot. But the reason it's a joke, the reason people are so quick to dismiss it and make fun of it, is because it was marketed so heavily during its rise, and people cared so much about the films and about the books and about the world that was created by Stephenie Meyer that they didn't really care about the quality of the writing or what the story was at the time. They were just so in love with the series and with the franchise. How did they do that? They used marketing. They marketed that book so hard, so strategically, and so thoughtfully that they really did convince people that this was an entire world that was worth being involved in. And now it's been a few years, we're able to look back and say, hey, that was sort of weird that we were all in love with that. But at the time we were, and we can't ignore that. So on today's podcast, I'm going to give you the 5 strategies that they used to market Twilight to the youth, to older generations, to younger generations, and just how they did that and how you can use those techniques as well. The first one is packaging your product correctly. So what Twilight did was they took a book that was okay. I don't want to say the book was bad. I don't want to say the book was great. The book was okay. It was fine. People really tend to attack Stephenie Meyer and the Twilight series, saying that it's really horribly written, just filled with grammatical mistakes and just awful, like bad storyline, bad relationship, bad characters. But guys, that's a bit dramatic. It's okay. It's not Pulitzer Prize winning. It's not anything extraordinary, but it's also not like a flaming bag of nothing. It is okay, but they knew how to package it correctly. There were obviously so many dumb titles that the Twilight series could have been called. It could have been called like Vampire Love. Could have been called Bella and Edward. It could have been Bella's Journey. And honestly, if you Google them, Stephenie Meyer came up with titles like that. But the publishing company knew better. Nobody was going to care about Bella's Journey, Vampire Love, or anything like that. But the title, Twilight. And if anyone remembers that original book cover with the pale hands holding the red apple with the black background and then just those white letters that said Twilight, that was so intoxicating is the correct word I think to use, because it lured you in. There was a sense of mystery. You didn't know what it was about. You could assume there was meanings behind the apple. People thought maybe religious meanings or purity or Adam and Eve. Like there were so many things that could have been read into about that. But the truth is that just looks good on a bookshelf. That's eye-catching. It's a red apple. So they really knew how to package it correctly to create that sort of mystery, wonder, and fantasy behind it without ever having to actually open up the book. So, they say don't judge a book by its cover, and I obviously believe that. I own some pretty ugly book covers, but people of the generation they were targeting it to aren't going to buy an ugly book cover. They wanted something that would look cool as they were carrying it, would be eye-catching, so they really knew how to package the original book correctly. And then later when the movies came out, they also packaged those correctly as well. Having Rob Pattinson and Kristen Stewart, having all of those beautiful model vampires on the cover of every movie, wearing like the coolest fashion, having the coolest haircuts, and acting as if they were all one big happy family. That's packaging the movie correctly because people wanted to be involved in that world. They wanted to watch a movie with a gorgeous leading actor and a gorgeous leading woman and all of their gorgeous friends living in this picturesque, gorgeous world. Now, obviously, the world itself wasn't picturesque. They chose very dark colors. It was filmed in Forks, Washington, which is very close to Seattle, where I live. So I can tell you firsthand, it's not beautiful here. But there is that element of mystery and loneliness and just sort of wanting to see the light, just wanting to see the light a little bit because it's so dark. So they created a cast within the film series that could be that light. The story was that light. So they packaged the movies and the books so incredibly correctly that they knew their target demographic would respond to it. The second thing they used, they knew that a classic story sells. So this is all the way back to Stephenie Meyer. Something that I talked about in the Harry Potter podcast is the reason it sold was because it was such an original idea. No one had really written about wizards in sort of a child's like perspective yet or had an adventure like that. Those books didn't really exist yet. But if you look at Twilight, if you boil it down, that's Romeo and Juliet. That is all that is. That is not an overwhelmingly original idea. That is not breaking news like Harry Potter was. It wasn't something that people hadn't heard before. But they sold it in a way, again, going back to packaging correctly, they sold it in a way that made it seem like it was a new idea, but it was an idea people were already comfortable with. Instead of Romeo being a Montague, he was a vampire. That's sort of how they played it. You know, Juliet's not a Capulet, she's a human dating a vampire. So it was the same story that people already know and love, but instead it was enhanced by this element of, oh no, they're vampires, instead of kings and queens and dukes and duchesses in this Victorian world. Now they're vampires in the modern world with iPods. It was the same story told a new way. Classic sells, and they knew people were already in for the idea. They knew people were already comfortable with the concept, so they didn't need to sell a whole new idea to people. The third thing they did is they never underestimated the power of their loyal target market. So as soon as that book was published and the fandom started to build, they knew to build on top of that. They knew not to neglect or disrespect or take advantage of their loyal fan base, because they knew that as long as it kept generating content, it didn't matter what they were generating, that fan base was going to love it. So as long as they were targeting them over and over again, it didn't matter what they were putting out. They could have put out a 30-second commercial spot of just Kristen Stewart and Rob Pattinson staring at each other for 10 seconds, and then it goes to black, and the rest of the commercial just plays out with a black screen for the rest of the 20 seconds. People would have watched that. People would have went nuts for that. It would have been weird, I'll give you that. But their loyal fan base just craved the content so much that they would have watched anything. They would have done anything. And that was a really big part of Twilight's marketing, is that they didn't really need to do anything because their loyal fan base was doing it for them. So they always made sure to target that fan base and respect that fan base and give them what they wanted so that they would do the marketing for them. Number 4, they struck while the iron was hot. So again, that first book was released, the fandom started building, and what did they do? Boom. First movie came out. All right, next book, next movie, next movie. This was very similar to what they did with the Harry Potter marketing. Again, if you haven't listened to that podcast, I do encourage that you go listen to it. But it's the idea that you're always keeping the conversation going and flowing and striking while the iron is hot so that you never lose the retention or any of the loyalty from your target fan base. You know, the fan base was very young for Twilight. They were mostly 13-year-olds, 13-year-old girls. If Twilight wasn't putting out new content, they were going to move on to the next thing. So although it was a loyal fan base, they would have watched anything, they still need something to interact with. They still needed content to be a fan of, which is why as soon as the last movie came out and there was nothing left, the fan base disappeared. People didn't care anymore. People stopped buying the merchandise. There were a few attempts that, Stephanie Meyer tried to re-release the book from Edward's perspective, and there was like a side book written about the unborn child from a different vampire colony, trying to do a very Harry Potter thing with that. But it didn't matter anymore. She didn't do it when the iron was hot. People had already faded away. People didn't care anymore. They built up this huge franchise by striking when the iron was hot and by building on their own success. The next thing that they did was they utilized merchandising and they expanded the franchise. This is something we've already been talking about a lot, but it's basically the idea of they had things for people to interact with all the time. There were video games, there was websites, there was t-shirts, there was makeup, there was nail polish, there was movies, there was TV spots, there were interviews with the cast, there was drama going on with the cast behind the scenes, there was books being released. Stephanie Meyer was always tweeting about it. They never stopped expanding the world, and they really utilized their merchandise and the content they were creating for their own benefit. And that was a really big thing that helped create the franchise and create the world. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and take a short break from the podcast, but when we come back, we're going to take those 5 concepts I just gave you, and we are going to tell you how you can use them for your own marketing. So stay tuned for that, because you are listening to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and I'll be right back.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and on today's episode, we are talking about the dramatic, the over-the-top, the fantastic world of Twilight. You either love it or you hate it, but you can't pretend it didn't exist. But for the decade that the Twilight franchise was present in media, they were coming out with books, they were coming out with movies, it took over the entire world of marketing. People were obsessed with this film series and with this book series and the world outside of it all. People genuinely cared when Rob Pattinson and Kristen Stewart broke up. People genuinely cared when they got together again. People cared enough about this entire series to invest their time, money, and energy into it. When really, guys, I don't want to offend anybody, but the book's not that good. It's not horrible. I've already said that it is not like the worst thing on earth, but it's not the greatest thing on earth either. It's not something we should all go to bed thinking about and wake up thinking about. So how did they do it? How did they create the world that we were all so obsessed with? One word, guys. I'm sure you already know what it is. They used marketing. So before the break, I taught you the 5 marketing strategies and techniques that the Twilight marketing team used and utilized to create the brand and the franchise that took over us for an entire decade. And now I want to take those 5 ideas and use them in your own marketing, whether you are a small business owner, whether you are a marketing specialist for a Fortune 500 company, whether you are the marketing officer for a Fortune 500 company. I want to give you these 5 techniques that are going to help you create the fascination and the involvement that came along with the Twilight franchise in your own marketing. So take what you want, leave what you don't, but please let me know your thoughts in the review down below or reach out through social media. So the first one, packaging your product correctly. We talked about how Twilight's packaging really all started with their initial book cover and how they created a sense of mystery and lure into the world that people didn't really know anything about yet. It was a mystery to all of us. We didn't know it was going to be about vampires. We didn't know it was going to basically be Romeo and Juliet, but we'll talk more about that later. But they created interest and intrigue with just a simple cover. We also talked about how they then took that simple idea by packaging their product correctly, and they packaged their movies and the merchandise and the TV spots and the characters, and everything was just so packaged incredibly specific and important to the brand that it made people want to get involved with the product itself. So what do you do? What is your packaging? What is your brand that you ensure is involved with every product you release? Is it a certain theme? Is it a color? Is it a logo? Is it all of those things? Because the truth is, it should be all of those things. If I'm getting a product from you, I want to see brand consistency. I want to be engaged with the packaging. I want to be engaged with the product itself. So how you package your product is so incredibly important, both for returning customers who are excited to see that brand, who are excited to interact with that packaging that they're used to, and for new customers who haven't interacted with you before, but are going to be encouraged to based on this packaging. So that is really, really important. The second thing they did is they understood that classic sells. As I said before, Twilight is just Romeo and Juliet with vampires. And people knew that. They weren't breaking the glass ceiling with Twilight. They weren't coming up with any new or original ideas with Twilight. It's Romeo and Juliet, but instead of the Montagues and the Capulets, it's vampires and humans. But the reason they did that and the reason they utilized that is because they understood that people were already comfortable and in love with that idea. They already were involved with that idea. So if you have something in your marketing that is such a classic idea, say you sell flowers and you know that flowers are just the most romantic gesture in the entire world, find a way to use that to market your audience. Use that to target your demographic and to really take advantage of the fact that they already know that flowers are something that people love and use to show their love, but you're going to tell them that in a new way, because that's what Twilight did, is they told us a story we already knew in a new way. The third thing you want to do is not underestimate the power of a loyal fan base. The Twilight really became an overnight success because of the fan base. People were in love with the books and wanted to talk about the books, and when the movies came out, they were just so excited to have more content to interact with. It didn't matter if the movie was good. It didn't matter if the movie was great. People just wanted more. And so if you have a fan base right now that you know is loyal and you know really respects your product and is excited about your product, then take advantage of that. Get them to write a review. Get them to share it on social media. Get them to film a video of themselves talking about the product, and then you can use that in your content. And to do that, send them a free bottle of your perfume that you create or of your lotion. Get your loyal fan base involved in the marketing so that, one, they're going to feel included. They're going to love it. They get to interact with your product more. And two, it's going to show other people, wow, their product is so good that their customers actually want to talk about their product. Guys, I have so many products that I love, but I never talk about because I'm not over the moon in love with them. But if there was one that I was super obsessed with and they asked me to talk about them, I would love that. I would talk about it all the time. I'd probably do a whole podcast episode about it. I mean, no, they would have to pay me. It would be like an advertising thing. But what I'm saying is that if you have that loyal fan base, even if you just have one person who you know loves your product more than anyone else, get them to write a review. It's so simple. It's so easy, but it is going to do wonders for your marketing. Number 4, strike while the iron is hot. Say you have a huge event on Friday and thousands show up. People are excited about your product. They're interacting with it. It was trending on Twitter. It was trending on YouTube. People were ecstatic to be there. People who weren't there were ecstatic to interact with the online content that was being produced by the event. What are you going to do next? The event is over. Step B, you need to strike while that iron is hot. Contact everyone who came. Post about it on social media. Start planning your next event. Plan a bigger event. Plan a tour. Plan a pop-up event. Go to other events. Strike while the iron is hot so that you can keep the conversation moving and flowing about your product so that people are always thinking and always talking and always considering interacting with your product, because the conversation never stops. They're going to either talk about your product or they're going to move on. So why not strike while that iron is hot and make sure that they're talking about your product or they're interacting with your product. Number 5, merchandise and expanding that universe. So such a good example for this is, and I've talked about them before, but there is a brew pub in Seattle that I love to go to. It's Optimism Brewing, and that's all they do is they make beer, but they sell t-shirts and coasters and their mugs and their glasses. They sell everything you can imagine in their merchandise, so that when you buy something and you take it home with you, and maybe you're like, oh, should I go out and buy beer tonight? Or should I go to Optimism? Even if you choose to buy beer tonight and not give them your returning business, you're still going to reach into your cupboard, pull out the glass, and it says Optimism Brewing, and you're going to be reminded of their product. You're going to go back. You're going to interact with them on social media. You're going to continue talking about them. So merchandise and expanding your universe could be huge for your company, because maybe people aren't going to your business every single day, but if they own something that reminds them of your business every single day, they're eventually going to go back, and you're going to get that return customer. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and take a short break from the podcast, but when we come back, we are going to talk about Twilight's product placement. This was a very big thing when Twilight came out. They were one of the first movies who just went above and beyond with product placement. So we are going to talk about all that and more when we come back. So stay tuned, because you are listening to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and I'll be right back.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and on today's episode, we are talking about Twilight. We are talking mostly about the film series. Although the franchise started out as a book series totaling in 4 books, Twilight, New Moon, Eclipse, and Breaking Dawn, we are actually focusing on how they created a marketing world that promoted the franchise and really created this fandom that was so loyal and so valuable to the success of Twilight. So right now, what I want to talk about is how successful Twilight, the film series, was because of the amount of product placement that was involved. So Twilight was one of those films that was seen by a mass majority of people. People saw it multiple times, so it only made sense that product placement played a huge part in the marketing for Twilight. So right now I want to talk about what part they played and how it influenced the audience that watched Twilight. So fans spotted a total of 65 individual products in the threequels Eclipse trailer. These products included everything from Rainier beer, Diesel jeans, Asics shoes, to Coca-Cola, just in the preview for the 3rd movie. That is crazy. So guys, this wasn't even the full movie. This was a 1-minute preview, had 65 individual products. That is insane. So now let's talk about, obviously, if there were 65 individual products just in the 3rd movie's trailer, obviously those products from all the other films were going to influence the audience's buying power, and it was going to, decide what other brands would be participating in this product placement and which brands were going to be popular that year. That's how big the Twilight franchise is they could honestly give that kind of power to a brand. They could say, okay, you are going to be the most popular this year because we really like your product, or you're paying us a lot of money to make us really like your product. So we're going to put Bella in a pair of Diesel jeans, and then Diesel jeans are going to be bought by every 13-year-old in America and Canada. That is how crazy the Twilight franchise was. That is the type of power they had, and how they decided to utilize that power is through their marketing and through product placement. They didn't just do Diesel jeans. They didn't just do Coca-Cola. They didn't just do Rainier beer. They had 65 individual product placements in one trailer for the third movie. I know I keep saying that stat over and over again, and I apologize. But guys, 65 individual product placements in a minute-long trailer for the third movie. That is insane. Think about how many product placements there must have been over 5 movies. Each were like 2 hours long. That's a lot of product placements. I'm not saying every individual product, there were millions, but think about how many times we probably saw Rainier beer in the Twilight franchise. I know I saw it quite a bit. I remember wondering what it was, and now I live in Seattle and I know what it is, and it's kind of nasty, but it's kind of cheap, so I understand why a cop from a small town was drinking it so much. Anyways, let's talk about some of the brands that signed on to do product placement with Twilight and then, really benefited from it. So a Billabong brand jacket cited in the second Twilight film ignited a buying frenzy. The brand eventually ran out of the jacket completely, and it could be found on eBay going for triple its retail price. In another instance, Infinite designed Bella's engagement ring for the second to last movie. They created multiple different rings that you could buy from $35 to $2,000. They understood that people were going to be incredibly obsessed with owning this ring, wanting to have it for themselves. It was such a big part in the book, and they knew it was sort of the climax of the entire movie, was sort of getting to finally see this engagement ring. So they knew people were going to want to buy it, so they thought ahead of creating multiple different versions and multiple different price limits so that everyone could get their own Bella's engagement ring. They also worked with the Twilight author Stephenie Meyer to create both the ring and Bella's bracelet that she wears in the film, that I believe was a gift from her father or her mother or something like that. So that was super interesting of how product placement didn't just play a role in here, wear this sweater, here, get this character to wear this jeans, or get this character to drink this beer. Instead, it played okay, let's think ahead. How are we going to get a new product in here, or which brand is going to be responsible for this really important piece of product? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And the solution they came up with was to create multiple different versions of this one product because they understood the frenzy and the buying power of Twilight fans. So here are the top 10 brands you can find in the Twilight films. Apple. Bella, all the Cullens, all the students all have Apple Macintosh computers. Number 2, Rainier beer. Everybody's drinking it in that film, except for the high schoolers, obviously. But at the diner, at the house, in the fridge, Rainier beer isn't any place anyone is drinking beer. Number 3, Diesel jeans. Nothing else even touches Bella Swan's legs except for Diesel jeans. Number 4, Coca-Cola. If you're not drinking Rainier beer, you're drinking Coca-Cola in the Twilight universe. Number 5, Jeep. I didn't know vampires loved Jeeps so much, but apparently they don't love Jeeps as much as they love Volvos, because that's number 6. Number 7 is Chevrolet, another car company. Vampires like their expensive cars, guys. What can I say? Number 8 is Nestle. Number 9 is Sony. And number 10 is Yamaha. So a lot of very big brands interacted with the movie and participated in the product placement. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and take a short break from the podcast, but when we come back, I'm going to talk about other movie franchises that created a similar buzz and a similar level of commitment from their fan base, similar to Twilight. So stay tuned for that, because you are listening to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and I'll be right back.
the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and on today's episode, we are talking about Twilight. We have talked about the film's marketing strategies. We have talked about their product placement. We have talked about stats and facts of the Twilight marketing world. And now that we are back, I want to talk about 10 movie series. Maybe they were books to start with, maybe they weren't, but they generated a similar level of fandom and obsession with their storylines and with their worlds that Twilight also created. And the main thing to focus on with all of these movies and all of these franchises we're going to talk about is that whether or not the book is good, whether or not the movie is good, is besides the point. These films, these books created a world using marketing and using marketing strategies, and specifically using the marketing strategies we talked about on today's podcast. It would be impossible to have the level of loyal fandom and obsession with these worlds without marketing. They definitely go hand in hand, which is so incredibly wonderful that we're able to create those worlds using marketing. So I think as marketers, whether you are a small business owner, whether you are just a dreamer hoping to work for a marketing company one day, or whether you are the CMO of a Fortune 500 company, these books and these movies and these worlds were created by marketing. And it's so interesting that we get to be a part of that world. So number one, I was obviously going to talk about 50 Shades of Grey. Why is it obvious I was going to talk about 50 Shades of Grey? Well, for those of you that don't know, let me educate you. 50 Shades of Grey started out as Twilight fan fiction. That is so ridiculous that something that started out as being fan fiction, I read once that the author of 50 Shades of Grey wrote it on her BlackBerry, could gross $1.3 billion in the film. What? That is so crazy, you guys. $1.3 billion from something that started out as Twilight fan fiction. If marketing wasn't involved there, then witchcraft definitely was. The Chronicles of Narnia, the film series specifically, grossed $291 million. The Lord of the Rings grossed $378 million. Earning the most out of the Lord of the Rings trilogy was The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King in 2003. The Hunger Games, more specifically The Hunger Games Catching Fire, brought in more than $408 million. The entire series itself was also huge. And also, guys, that's a really good example. We talked about it in the Harry Potter podcast, but The Hunger Games is a great book. I'm not saying 50 Shades of Grey isn't, but The Hunger Games is a really great YA series that people really seem to attach to. But the reason they were able to attach to it is because of the marketing around it. Number 5, Shrek. Shrek brought in $441.2 million. It's a movie about an ogre. First of all, it's a great movie about an ogre. But $441 million, again, guys, either marketing or witchcraft. Jason Bourne. There were 3 books in the series and 4 movies in the series. For all of the movies together, it brought in $687.8 million. The Harry Potter franchise brought in $2.39 billion in the domestic box office. If you want to learn more about the Harry Potter book series, again, I've talked about it a lot on this podcast, but we did talk about it completely on its own, fully focused in a different podcast episode, so make sure you go check it out. It is called The Wizarding World of Marketing. You can find it on our Twitter, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, you can find it anywhere you're listening to this podcast, so make sure after you're done with this one, you go check that one out as well. Number 8, Divergent. Divergent is another YA novel. People do consider it to be sort of like a ripoff of The Hunger Games, but it only actually has 3 novels, and the first installment of the sci-fi film franchise spawned took flight in 2014, and all of them together created $288.9 million. Number 9, Diary of a Wimpy Kid brought in $75.7 million. And number 10, The Maze Runner brought in $348.3 million. All of these series brought something new to the marketing world, brought something new to the entertainment, to the media world, but they all also created a loyal fan base that was willing to interact with them until there was nothing left to interact with, which is so incredibly interesting and amazing that marketing was able to create that for people. Okay, everyone, that is it for today's podcast. We're going to go ahead and head out of here, but I will see you on the next episode of the GSMC Marketing Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mackenzie Jaquish, and I'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the GSMC Marketing News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to any podcast app, and you'll find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news, you'll find it all on the GSMC Podcast Network. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.